Okay, Jesus said in Matthew 5:19, do and teach God's law. This is God's law number 40, adultery. Hello, everybody. Welcome. I'm Jim McCotter. Here's God's law number 40 from God's law book of Deuteronomy, in Deuteronomy 22, verse 22. Quote, if a man is discovered committing adultery, both he and the woman must die. In this way you will purge Israel of such evil. End quote. Adultery defined as simply a man or woman having sex with each other while married to someone else. The seventh of the Ten Commandments states in Deuteronomy 5:18, you must not commit adultery. End quote. God's moral law has three parts. 1, the Ten Commandments. 2, the statutes. 3, the judgments. This verse in Deuteronomy 22:22 is the judgment for adultery, which is capital punishment. Leviticus 20:10 also confirms God's judgment for adultery. Quote, if a man commits adultery with another man's wife, both the man and the woman who have committed adultery must be put to death. End quote. In the New Testament, going out to the Gentile nations, if a nation does not apply capital punishment for adultery as God's civil law requires, even so God himself will judge all the sexually immoral. Hebrews 13:4 says, quote, marriage should be honored by all and the marriage bed kept pure, for God will judge the adulterer and all the sexually immoral. End quote. Picture a seesaw with adultery and judgment at one end and marriage and honor at the other end. If the full weight of judgment for adultery is capital punishment at the one end, then the highest honor for marriage will be high at the other end. To reduce the judgment for adultery is to reduce the honor of marriage. Jesus confirming capital punishment for adultery. Jesus fulfilled all the Old Testament ceremonial laws, which only he could fulfill, but all the rest of God's law, all his righteous moral law, is eternal. Psalms 119, verse 160 says in the New Living Translation, quote, all your righteous laws are eternal. End quote. Moreover, this includes all God's moral righteous judgments, as the King James translates it in Psalms 119, 160, quote, every one of your righteous judgments endures forever, end quote. Nonetheless, some naive Christians still believe Jesus threw out capital punishment because of the story of the woman caught in adultery. But I think this story actually confirms that Jesus believed in his law of stoning for adultery. Let's look at it and see. John 8:4 through 11, quote, the Pharisees said to Jesus, this woman was caught in the act of adultery. The law of Moses says to stone her. What do you say? They were trying to trap him into saying something they could use against him, but Jesus stooped down and he wrote in the dust with his finger. They kept demanding an answer, so he stood up again and said, let any one of you who is without sin be the first to throw a stone at her. Then he stooped down again and wrote in the dust. When the accusers heard this, they slipped away one by one, beginning with the oldest, until only Jesus, was left in the middle of the crowd with the woman. Then Jesus stood up again and said to the woman, where are your accusers? Did even one of them condemn you? No, Lord, she said. And Jesus said, neither do I. Go and sin no more. End quote. Here's why I believe these verses actually confirm that Jesus believed in the death sentence for adultery. First, if Jesus knew in his law this was to no longer be valid, he certainly would have confirmed it then, but he did not. As the Gospels record time and again, the Pharisees knew Jesus believed all his law was to be obeyed, and certainly the law judgment for adultery. They knew if Jesus denied her death sentence, he would lose all credibility. Then also, Jesus did not deny the death sentence, but just the opposite. He examined it in accordance to the law. And finally, first, Jesus started writing on the ground, and then a second time he wrote again on the ground. Jesus always answered the Pharisees with scriptures. Jesus no doubt was writing scriptures showing how the Pharisees were guilty in not following God's law and what they were doing. God's law states, number one, both the woman and the man, adulterer, were to be brought forth. Where was the man? Number two, there must be 2 or 3 witnesses for any death sentence case. And number 3, a false witness is to receive the same judgment for the crime that they are falsely accusing the other person. With adultery, it is to be stoned to death. No wonder when, quote, the accusers heard this, they slipped away one by one, beginning with the oldest, until only Jesus was left, end quote. The Pharisees were guilty of all 3 of God's laws pertaining to adultery. No doubt Jesus was quietly writing out on the ground these scriptures regarding adultery for everyone to see, the Pharisees as well as the crowd. The first false witness to cast any stone would be signing his own death sentence. That's why the eldest was the first to slip away. He knew how Jesus was trapping them with their own trap for him. The Pharisees had put Jesus in what was essentially a legal adultery trial, and in God's law, the accusing witnesses of the crime were always to cast the first stone. This helped prevent the sin of false witnesses. When Jesus said, "Let him who is without sin cast the first stone," the phrase "without sin" is misinterpreted when taken out of context and not knowing the rest of God's law. Number one, God's law required that the accusing witnesses must cast the first stone. Number two, God's law required the false accusing witnesses must receive the sentence they intend for the other person. Number three, God's law required that both the man and the woman, adulterers, be brought forth. Number four, God's law required that men carry out God's law. And number five, God's law required that all adulterers be put to death. Even if someone ignorantly believes that God's moral civil law should not be applied today, during the time of the Gospels, Jesus was living in Israel under God's Mosaic law. Jesus was promoting and totally following all God's law, Matthew 5:17. Now, the text itself does not say, quote, someone who has never sinned, end quote. Moreover, point 3 through 5 above would also be scripturally contradictory. But in this context, as an adulterous legal trial, witness accusers must be without sin in reference to the crime, being an unbiased and honest witness. Jesus caught these Pharisees in their own unrighteous trap. Either they lied and did not catch her in adultery, or the man that they did not bring forth may have been one of them. Either way, they were now not without sin. So they all slipped away. Finally, only Jesus was left in the middle of the crowd with the woman. Then Jesus stood up again and said to the woman, "Where are your accusers? Didn't even one of them condemn you?" "No, Lord," she said. And Jesus said, "Neither do I. Go and sin no more." The woman now had no accusers, nor did Jesus witness her in adultery, and thus could not accuse her. So Jesus followed the law fully. Even if Jesus thought she was guilty, because she had no accusers, Jesus said, "Go and sin no more." Jesus clearly believed in capital punishment for adultery and other crimes, Matthew 15:4, Mark 7:10, as did the apostles, Romans 1:32 and 13:4. Early American law. Because of God's law on adultery, all early American colonies and early states had death penalty laws for adultery. For example, in 1641, Massachusetts law declared, quote, "If any person commits adultery with a married or espoused wife, the adulterer and the adulteress shall surely be put to death," Exodus 30:14, end quote. Similar adultery death penalty laws were also enacted by Connecticut in 1642, Rhode Island in 1647, New Hampshire in 1680, and Pennsylvania in 1705. The Texas Criminal Appeals Court in Hardin v. State in 1898 stated, quote, "Thou shalt not commit adultery is our law as well as the law of the Bible," end quote. The Washington Supreme Court in Scherfels and Schiffels in 1955 stated, quote, adultery, whether promiscuous or not, violates one of the 10 Commandments and the statutes of this state. When God's law rules society, as it did in early America, adultery was hardly heard of and divorce was very rare. For example, records from the Massachusetts General Court show there were only 229 divorce petitions between 1692 and 1785, almost 100 years. God's laws save lives. Reject God's law, destroy families. Destroy families, lose a nation. Jeremiah 6:19 says, quote, hear, you earth, I am bringing disaster on this people, the fruit of their schemes, because they have not listened to my words and have rejected my law. Hosea 4:6. My people are destroyed from lack of knowledge. Because you have rejected knowledge, I also reject you as my priest, because you have ignored the law of your God. I also will ignore your children.